feeling very overwhelming and inundated. But now more than ever, I think it's time that we gather and listen in community and channel our sometimes fleeting collective energy. So today's conversation, I think, comes from wanting to understand the global landscape beyond the headlines and feel confident in how we can move together. I'm Vidya Nair, and I have the privilege of serving as the Associate Vice President of Philanthropy here at the Equality Fund. And as you may have seen, there's a lot of meeting the moment conversations that are happening, and it feels important to share with this community, our Equality Fund community, the insights, the trends, and the analysis that we're seeing in real time. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the traditional and unceded territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. I'm thrilled to introduce our conversationalists today, our incredible leaders, Sophie Efange, the Associate Vice President of Policy, at the Equality Fund, and Jess Tomlin, our beloved CEO. Sophie and Jess don't just bring their expertise, but their personal passion for this work as well. And before we begin, I think it's just a great opportunity to share a little bit more about who you are and the work that you're holding before we dive into today's conversation. So over to you, Sophie.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all. It's afternoon this time of day for me here in the United Kingdom. I'm Sophie Efange. I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the Equality Fund, based here in London in the UK. So I work across the Equality Fund, my work really to lead and discuss the strategic priorities for the organization's policy work. So looking at how we resource feminist movements, how we engage with with organizations and partnerships around the world. So a big part of our policy focus is the work that I lead. So I'd like to say the ways in which I've kind of engaged in this work as a human being coming into EF is a real kind of personal conviction and drive for looking to dismantle a lot of these invisible structures and systems that we have in place that continue to oppress marginalized peoples and communities. And I myself come from a family on both sides with very, very strong matriarchs. There's been a strong lineage of African feminisms across both my families. And I'd say I come from working on women's economic justice here in the UK before I came to the Equality Fund. So a lot of my focus has been on how to resource gender equality and women's rights. So that's been a big part of the work that I've done also in recent years. So thanks, Vidya.
Thanks, Sophie, and welcome. And an invitation to you all joining us also to introduce yourselves, whether it's in the chat. So glad to have you here. Over to you, Jess. I don't think you need a lot of introduction, but an opportunity to say hello.
Oh, well, hello. Nice to see you all. Many, many familiar faces and familiar names. My name's Jess Tomlin, and I'm the CEO of Equality Fund. For many on this call, you'll remember me in my days with the Match International Women's Fund, and I have carried on in this work now leading the Equality Fund, which is my great privilege. Like Sophie, come from a long line of strong-willed feminists. This, in my situation, they're redheads, maybe worth saying that what I think has brought me to this work is having worked in a lot of global contexts, having worked throughout the world with the UN and multilateral institutions and government agencies. I came to realize about 12, 13 years ago that where I wanted to put my energy and where I felt the most potential for accelerating change was in the work happening in human rights movements and feminist movements specifically. So that is where I have been, and have the privilege to lead this organization who is really trying to ramp this effort up, and resource these leaders and activists with the energy and the stability and the momentum that they need in order to drive this work. So that's me.
Thanks, Jess. And thank you all for introducing yourselves as well in the chat. So I think let's kick it off and begin. It's an hour together and there's a lot to cover and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from this community as well and we want to make a lot of time for that. We're living in a moment, I think, of profound change, one that's reshaping both the landscape of gender equality, the support feminist movements are driving globally. And, we've talked a lot about this at the Equality Fund, that this shift is unlike anything that we've ever seen, and the word we've been using, I think, is unprecedented, both in its scope, scale, and size. So, we're seeing all this, feeling all this, Jess. I'm just wondering if you can speak to some of these shifts that are making the headlines and the effects that this is having and what you're hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just, like something is definitely in the air. I would be lying if I said that we're sleeping well in this particular moment in time. The shifts are both dramatic and exaggerated in ways that I certainly haven't seen in my lifetime. Of course, top of mind for us all is what's happening in the States right now. Many of you know that there has been a decision to cut USAID. And USAID, for those who don't know, is the aid department of the US government. It was started by Kennedy. It was a way to really ensure the US's influence and soft power around the world. It was a way of showing up as good Americans, both humanitarian and civic-minded. And it was a way in order to, as I say, really flex soft power and political influence and business interests as well of the US government through making friends. What it has since become is the largest donor in the world. Right now, we are trying to get the numbers, but it's anywhere between 40 billion in core costs and 72 billion in core costs that go out in international assistance, including humanitarian aid. And those are very, very real, staggering numbers. And so we find ourselves in this moment where the shifts that will, like the ways in which that will impact UN institutions, whether that's the WHO, UNICEF, or certainly some of those organizations like UNRWA, where I used to work, have absolutely got targets on their backs. So the impact on multilateralism and the impact on the aid infrastructure around the world, including health and life-saving measures, is, I think, yet to be truly understood. One of the projects that I worked on when I was in Zambia was with PEPFAR, which is a U.S. agency that affiliate agency that's launched by George Bush, and it was really about getting life-saving drugs and antiretroviral treatments to people living with HIV/AIDS. And that initiative has been going on since I was in Zambia in the early 2000s at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And we know about 21 million people are receiving antiretroviral drugs through this program, and that has stopped now. So what we are sort of trying to do with the Equality Fund is really understand the scale and give ourselves a moment to really then think about how we can be in most and best service, given the impacts that this is going to have. This is going to have very real impacts on folks' lives. This is not unique. The US is the most drastic and jarring and frankly, financially destabilizing. But this is part, in my opinion, this is part of a larger trend. We've been very disappointed to watch the Netherlands, who were like this bastion of feminist development policy, who have been initiating and innovating in this space for a really long time, have been a predictable, reliable friend to feminist movements globally. They have completely backed out and of doing that now, and we envision there'll be another $1 billion delta just from the Dutch leaving the sector alone. And we are seeing that in other countries like Sweden and France and Belgium and Switzerland. And the rise, because of the right rising in Europe, we're starting to see this as collateral damage, right? The money that has moved. Many of us on this call know that it's, movements and feminist organizing and women's rights work has never been funded well. So when you take out USAID and you take out some of the more predictable progressive funders, it really leaves a bleak picture. I think this is not totally surprising. If I'm honest, we have for some time been tracking the rise of the anti-gender movement and how that is showing up around the world. This has been a decades-long effort to scale back rights. And we have seen it in multiple ways. I think what we know now is we know how that movement has organized. It's been organizing itself for decades. They are working across multiple spheres in multilateral institutions and advocacy work, just as well down to the grassroots. It's very, very well funded, not only by the Christian fundamentalists, but also by the Russian Orthodox Church and others. We know that they are very, very good at organizing and finding common ground and common purpose and building connective tissue. It is itself a very, very strong movement, and it is a movement that has elected Donald Trump. And so when we look at the moment that we're in and we see the regression and we see the move away from this, I believe this is a concerted, predictable effort that has been undertaken over the last number of decades. We know $7 billion moved into this movement in the last couple of years, and that's just what we can count. That is not what's going around the church basket on Sundays. That is just what's being reported to revenue agencies. And so the scale and the depth of the opposition, frankly, is more significant than it has ever been. We are feeling it. Our partners are feeling it. There is not one partner that works alongside the Equality Fund. And as a reminder to this group, we work with 1,000 partners in 100 countries ever since the inception of the Equality Fund 4 years ago. And there isn't a partner that is not deeply affected by this in some way or another, whether that relates to how they need to operate, the safety protocols they need to put in place, the extent to which they are able to operate freely, the legal restrictions on their work, or the sense of safety or wellness, or just the infringement of their operational capacity. There is no safe organization. And so we are in a moment of grappling with all that.
Thanks, Jess. And I think we'll have a chance also to share some real examples of the work that our partners are doing and that are under threat, I think, because of this shift. Sophie, I'd love for you to come in here and to share, the position of the Equality Fund as a global fund, and we're working in partnership with many governments. And can you share more about this impact, particularly in light, as Jess shared, global trends in foreign aid and recent policy shifts of governments and also official development assistance cuts?
Sure, Vidya. So I think just briefly to note that many of you will know that a key component of our funding model at the Equality Fund includes our strong bilateral partnerships. So that's our partnerships with governments, so namely Canada and the UK. And of course, we're immensely appreciative of those relationships that we've managed to foster over the 5 years. But as Jess had already signaled earlier, we're currently witnessing some of the biggest cuts in foreign aid around the world. And this is beyond just the US. So a lot of our attention and energy has been consumed by that over the last few weeks with the US and the re-election of Trump. But there have been wider shifts around the foreign aid ecosystem over the last year. And just to kind of give you a really top line view, if you like, of how much money is at stake of being lost, in addition to what's been announced from the US, is that there's about $2 billion that's going to be cut from the EU over the next 3 years. The Dutch have announced $1 billion over the next 5 years. France, another $1 billion to its budget this year alone. Sweden, 300 million over the next 2 years. Switzerland, 280 million to be cut from its budget this year. Germany and Canada currently in the midst of federal elections, and there will likely be potential changes in funding to foreign aid as well through them. And just this week alone, Belgium announced a 25% reduction. in its foreign aid budget. So I think what we're seeing is a wholesale review of how governments are doing their funding and providing foreign assistance. And I think, as Jess mentioned already as well, it's really tied to a move towards right-wing governments across a lot of European countries, governments that have previously been very much seen foreign aid as a priority for their work, a key part of their national security interests, if nothing else. But we're seeing a drastic shift in that. And as a result, we're going to have to reconfigure how we are going to be able to resource and fund feminist movements and rights moving forward. Because this model effectively seems to, if it hasn't already died, it's on its last legs for sure.
And those are sizable cuts, right? And sizable numbers. And it's hard to envision philanthropy stopping the gap in some of those bleeds because it's so large. I'm wondering if we can contextualize this also a little bit more, and what it means for impacts on the ground in terms of the women's organizations that we're supporting, the people behind these movements. Jess, Sophie, what are we hearing from some of our partners? And I think you had started sharing some of this already, Jess, but Sophie, I know you had also wanted to read a letter from one of our partners, and maybe I'll go to you first and then come to you, Jess.
I shall do that. So as part of our wider tracking of how our partners, our grantee partners, are responding to the most recent wave of cuts, we've been doing a general outreach and have received lots and lots of feedback from a variety of different partners. And we received this letter in particular from one of our partners called Alianka, the Alliance Against Discrimination of LGBT people in Albania. So briefly, I'll read you the letter. Dear Equality Fund team, I hope this message finds you well. Unfortunately, over the past few days, we have been navigating a deeply unsettling situation. Following Trump's inauguration, a series of executive orders have led to the immediate termination of two of our major projects, the Initiative of Feminist Queer Academy, funded by the American Embassy, and the Initiative on Political Participation of LGBTI People, funded by NDI, National Democratic Institute in the United States. Hence, their support has terminated. Effective immediately, we are unable to proceed with any spending or implement the planned activities for these projects. This has placed us in an extremely difficult position, particularly with the Feminist Academy scheduled for the beginning of next month, which was funded by the American Embassy and already has 21 registered students. Additionally, the second project, supported by NDI, focused on increasing LGBTI participation in voting through advocacy and lobbying efforts with politicians from various parties. This has also come to a halt. Honestly, the situation is impacting us not only financially, but also emotionally and psychologically. It has left us with a heightened sense of fear and insecurity for our rights and existence as LGBTI individuals and activists. The hate message on our social media, but also on TV by many politicians and public figures have intensified, with threats stating that now Trump is in power, they will see what we will do to them, and highlighting that LGBTI people are a threat for the kids and Albanian society. The leader of the opposition party stated publicly that if they come into power, they will present anti-propaganda laws. Despite this, we are resilient, we are accustomed to stress and pressure, and while the loss of support from American agencies is a significant setback, it will not deter us. Instead, it strengthens our resolve to continue fighting for our community. Very, very, very strong words. And I think a small glimpse into the kinds of impacts that we're seeing so early on, let alone, 3, 4, 5 months down the line, but just a little insight into the kind of on-the-ground experiences at present.
Thanks, Sophie. And a testament, I think, to the decades of organizing that has happened in region. Jess, over to you to share a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many places that I'm looking right now where I'm feeling spots of hope. Although for those who know me, there are many on this call. There are bright spots of optimism that I hope we'll get to, Vidya. But I'm really drawn to some of the lesser known, the lesser in media crises, whether that's Sudan or whether that's in Goma, North Kivu. Many on this call will know that the Rebel M23 group has risen in power. There's been a significant increase in conflict in the area. This is a part of the world that has just been shattered by violence. And as many of us know, that when violence goes up in the streets or amongst rebel factions, what that means is that violence goes up in the home, as does sexual violence, which is so often used as a weapon of war. And unfortunately, we are seeing that again in a really worrisome pattern in Eastern Congo. And as this conflict intensifies, it's just not on the radar, right? But what is on the radar for us is the fact that they have been receiving humanitarian aid from USAID, and that will very likely stop. We know since January 25th that people in Goma in particular have had to stay inside their homes and have not been let out. And there is no access to humanitarian funding at this moment because of all of these stop work orders. And so an organization that we support that has been working in this area for a really long time, Fonds pour les femmes congolaises, is doing what women's organizations and feminist movements do well, right? So they're responding in real time. They're activating their local network. They're gathering on behalf of the community. They're feeding the folks that need to be fed. They're providing safety and protection and shelter for those who are not safe at home or are not safe in the streets. And they are continuing to just build that connective tissue and that safety net, but doing it as feminist leaders. So always looking at it from the perspective of how they can be in support of those who have the most to lose. And those who are most vulnerable. And so I think we're very worried about Fonds pour les femmes congolaises and their ability to actually respond in this moment. And we also understand that they're the best actors to do so, because they are not in the same way under the doctrine of a government telling them to act or to not act. Rather, they have these independent resources from the Equality Fund and others to be able to respond in real time in a way that's culturally appropriate and in a way that manages the dynamic in real time.
Thank you both. I think it's helpful to share, we have the privilege of hearing directly from grantee partners, often daily, in terms of the struggles on the ground, and to share in real time some of the stories coming out of community, with this trusted community in particular. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you had spoken to this, both of you, earlier in remarks, in terms of how the Equality Fund is thinking and strategizing and our early responses to what we're hearing. So want to turn it over to you both to share how we're getting ready, or readying ourselves, or what's the right word to use here, but in this moment, how we're responding.
Can I kick off, Jess? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll kick off, Jess, and there will be some others that I'm sure. So yes, as we've already kind of outlined, this is a really seismic shift at this point in time. So I think we are trying to think of and work collaboratively with others to determine what is the next best step. So as we've already kind of mentioned before, we've been gathering a lot of information and data from our grantee partners as a way to understand what the real life impacts are. And we know that those impacts are going to be, it might take a while before we see the full effect of those impacts. So we're still kind of trying to gather that information and see where we are best fit to plug in some of those areas for support. I think we also want to ensure that we're doing a long-term secure support, providing long-term secure support for our grantee partners, so that we always talk about long-term flexible funding for our grantee partners, and making sure that we commit and stick to those values as an organization, and making sure that the resources that grantees receive, they can use flexibly to address whatever need it is that they have at this point in time, and not be too prescriptive. And also identifying opportunities where, internally, where we can make sure that if we do have additional resources, to be able to try and plug some of these gaps. Although, of course, as we talked about the figures before, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that stands to be lost. But in this immediate, at this immediate start, what are the things that we can do to try and plug those gaps? I think some of the other ways in which we're thinking from a a policy standpoint as well, is working in collaboration with our feminist funds or our peer funds, trying to make sure that we have coordinated messaging at this really important time. Because as you can appreciate, a lot of governments, a lot of philanthropic institutions, they are receiving lots of competing demands for resources. So I think it is a really critical time for us to be aligned in making sure that we're clear about what the message is, what is at stake here, the amount of money that stands to be lost, and trying to find some way forward on this. And working with our peer funds, I think, is a key part of that, as well as working with Canadian allies as well here. Oh, I say here, I'm in the UK, but work as the Equality Fund in Canada, making sure that we're working with our Canadian allies there as well, in terms of what's to come with this forthcoming government. So yeah, I'd say that I'll stop there, Jess, because I know that there are others that you will touch in on. But it's really important to note that things are happening at such an alarming speed that we've got to be agile and be prepared to move around quite a bit in response to every news alert that comes in every single day.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I don't know. So I want to say first that when I saw this time with you all, I asked Vidya to put more time into the agenda so that there was opportunity for reflections and questions and insights from this community. I know many of you on this call, and I know you have things to say and questions to ask. So I really want to invite you to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to have egg on my face for not filling this time with our answers and insights. I really hope that we can have some questions and some dialogue with you all. There's this Ezra Klein podcast, and one of them, it's called Don't Believe Him, and it's 15 minutes long. He's a New York Times commentator, and I highly recommend you read it, because what he does is he reminds us that what's happening right now is what the Steve Bannon and others call muzzle velocity, which is just constant barrage of things that are supposed to shock us. And that's what we're in right now, right? So we can't let that happen, right? We have to know what's happening inside the churn, the spin, the tornado that's being created. And we are trying as Equality Fund to step outside of it and know what's actually happening and not get caught up in it. The comfort that I have, and I think the reason it doesn't feel bleak inside Equality Fund in the same way, is that, first of all, we have the privilege of working on the solution and thinking about the future. I fundamentally believe this is a very, very dark part of our history, and a lot of pain will be caused, but it's not the end game. This is the last bastion of the broligarchy who are standing up in their power. But it is not what will stay forever, because people-powered movements powered by people, are the only thing in history that has ever truly brought about change. I don't think that's going to change now. But it doesn't mean that the next several years and the repercussions of that will not be enormous. So the other piece I think that helps me in this moment is that this is precisely the reason the Equality Fund was built. For those on this call who've been on this journey for a long time with us, you'll know that the reason that we wanted to bring a model into the world like Equality Fund that was independent, that was accountable to feminist movements and feminist movements alone, that was at scale and significance so that it could meaningfully support partners over a long period of time. There is a woman on this call, and you know who you are, Diana Rivington, who taught me that this work is a marathon and not a sprint. And I have taken that to heart in my leadership of the Equality Fund. And that is the essence of what we have been trying to build inside this organization, is a model that will stand the test of time, the model that will accompany partners for the marathon and not the sprint, and that will not be subject or vulnerable to the whims or trends of philanthropy or government. It will not be vulnerable to USAID. It will not be vulnerable to the Canadian government. And it will not be vulnerable to a philanthropist who one day has decided to support feminist movements and has the next day decided to support health systems or whatever, or leave the sector altogether, which is something that we're seeing as well. And so I'm really bolstered by that. I don't think we anticipated the scale and the magnitude of the fallout that we're seeing right now. But I do believe we're onto something, because if we don't have something that's safeguarded and protected and that's going to do this really brave work alongside these very brave activists and movement leaders, then we are in trouble. And I think Equality Fund is one of the few bright lights in this moment, you know? So I guess the other piece I would share is that what we're also reflecting as we step outside of muzzle velocity is like, what is our unique and best, highest use here? How can we uniquely leverage our social, political, financial capital in a way that is the most strategic? We can't make up for the $70 billion delta that the sector is now to experience, but we can be strategic and surgical in our movements so that we're investing in the highest potential initiatives, that we're keeping thought leadership alive, and that we're working to support those who are saving those who are most at the margins, and ensuring that they stay on this planet. And so those are some of the considerations that we're thinking about. That translates into our grant making and how we do that. Already I have a number of documents in my email that I will get to later today that's going to move critical resources out to the organizations who are most vulnerable in this moment, who are threatened to close, who can't pay their staff, who can't fund the abortion clinics, who can't do this life-saving work. And as as the weeks carry on, we will pan out and really be thinking about how we can be how our unique positioning in the world and the axis that we sit in terms of our ability to work alongside government partners and multilateral institutions and philanthropic partners and investment partners, what can we uniquely do as Equality Fund to be the most meaningful and most impactful partner in this moment?
Thanks, Jess, for sharing those reflections. And I think, what I'm hearing is from Sophie, from you, long-term flexibility, Jess, agility and responsiveness. And these are just also the key tenets of how philanthropy shows up in this moment and always has been, right? And the ability to be agile and nimble. And so just appreciating you both, I think, for tying those reflections into what it means in the state of philanthropy now, given that this is also the opportunity to convene with our philanthropic community. So we had promised some time for question and answer, unless you both have questions also of this community, but otherwise invite folks to come off mute, use your camera if you're comfortable, or drop it in the chat. Questions for Jess and Sophie, the Equality Fund, and really, again, grateful for you all making the time to join us in conversation today. I know there was one earlier maybe that I can get us started with, which was, Jess, you referenced the DRC, and curious if you're worried about hearing whether the conflict is likely to expand outside of the DRC or expand within the country.
I mean, yes, I think the short answer is yes. There's deep destabilization politically. I think there's a ton of vulnerability in that country. There's the ability for I think this is the thing when the world is looking elsewhere. It's really good for corruption. It's really good for leaders that thrive in crisis. And it's really good for dictators, and it's really good for rebel uprisings, right? Because the world's attention is elsewhere. There are a number of countries on the African continent that I'm deeply concerned about, but Africa isn't the only continent I'm worried about either. You know, for some time, I've been very, very worried about DRC. I think what's happening now in terms of its critical mineral, you know, the amount of critical minerals that the world needs from this country, the depth and vast richness that this country possesses, and then the deep political insecurity that it possesses is a recipe for disaster.
Thanks, Jess. Noting that some folks also might have to step away, so appreciating you making the time. But I'm also wondering if you had we had shared so much on this, you know, 37 minutes together so far. But I'm just wondering if there's one takeaway that you could share. You know, it's complex, it's a lot, it's overwhelming. I'm wondering what's your one takeaway, and it's hard, I guess, to synthesize that. So forgive me for asking the question, but a takeaway for this community or those that are really dedicated, you know, and decades of supporting this work, either through the Equality Fund and Match or just in general, and those that are new to this space. What's your one takeaway with all this? You know, I don't want to call it noise, but also it's noisy and it's very busy. Sophie?
Big question, Vidya. But yes, it is. There is a lot of noise out there at this point in time. So I think trying to decipher what is the kind of signal amongst all of this noise, I think it's really, really pertinent and really important. And I think the thing to note is that yes, I think as feminists and working within feminist movements, yes, we're used to working in crises, right? So this is a perpetual state of being, is to lurch from one crisis to another. And I think that we've adjusted or learned or accommodated ourselves to respond to these kind of moments in this kind of way. But I don't think we should go about normalizing it. This isn't a way in which we should carry on living, for sure. But I think the one thing I would say is the need for absolute patience, for sure, to see how things are progressing, how they're moving, not to feel this sense of absolute overwhelm, which I think is so easy in this moment because of how much information is flooding the zone right now. I think it's very easy to despair and take a seat back. I think there are some potential silver linings, green shoots, if you like, at this juncture, which is that I think it's what this is doing is opening up the conversations around what a future, a post-aid future might look like. And I think, of course, this has to be a considered discussion. If you take into account that the funding cuts from USAID are causing the removal of critical life-saving work and resources. But beyond that, is there the scope for us to reimagine, to rethink how this question on aid is addressed, how it's packaged, how it's understood moving forward? I think it's opening up really important conversations. And just the ways in which things are going to be progressing over this next year, I think how countries are going to be responding, reflecting, and reacting, I think will be really important. But also just fundamentally, do not give up on feminist movements. This is a time that they absolutely need you, and in full force and full effect right now as well. I think that's really important to pinpoint.
The marathon and being in community and in it for the long haul also. I think that's a really strong message. Jess?
So I agree. I generally agree 100% of the time with Sophie because she's genius. I maybe will take a more of a self-reflective stance on this answer. I think in part because human rights movements writ large have been just in a state of scarcity for so long, right? That it has invited in us a desire to stay in our lane, to exist in silos. And that is not how we win. And I think we're seeing that in the gender equality space, right? there's the work that feminist movements are doing, which is rather cross-cutting, but there's also, there's women's economic justice, there's sexual and reproductive health rights work, there's gender and climate justice initiatives, there's political participation and political leadership, there's, health-related pieces, there's education-related pieces. And what I've witnessed in my career, especially over the last 10 years, is that there's been a siloing of that work. And so even within the gender equality space, we haven't done a very good job of working together and busting through those silos. And that means that we're not necessarily as strong as we could be. And it also means that we are competing for resources. And we know that like 0.2% of all official development assistance is going to this work. So it's not like we're competing for vast pools of money. It has kept us small. And then I think more broadly than that, outside of the gender equality space, and I'm looking at the racial justice movement and the climate movement and the farm and food and land movements and all of these movements and leaders and organizations that are working to like build a future. And they're also siloed. And competing for money within their own movements. And so I think our job right now, as folks who are trying to just see past this moment, I think our job is to bust through those silos. I think our job right now is to build as much connective tissue and as much strength across our movements as we possibly can. And that means, and with that, I think will come abundance. And that means that we have to be less polarizing in our views. It means we have to not be policing the wokeness. It means that we have to find ways to build connection, community, belonging. And this is something the Equality Fund does really well, actually. We have built a table at the Equality Fund with feminists who've been on the front lines of this work for decades, as well as venture capitalists, as well as corporate, bankers, as well as investment folks, as well as governments, as well as, political leaders. And they're all there and they all have a common vision as to what the future is that they're trying to build. Do we speak the same language? No, absolutely not. Do we have to work at that? Yeah. Is it easier not to? Mm-hmm. But that's not how we get there. And so I'm actually leaning on Equality Fund a lot for the competencies that are going to be required of us and of our movements to really bust through those silos and build that connective tissue, weave that connective tissue so that we're stronger again.
Thanks, Jess. And I think, what you shared speaks to the unmet demand also that we know exists, right? Just from the Equality Fund's call for proposals to date, it's north of $900 million Canadian of work that we know is good work and that needs to continue because that's the future we need to hold, but we can't fund it all at the same time. And so the demand is there. And we know the solutions are there. So how do we be in it for the long haul, be in community, have different approaches and tactics to organizing, like you've talked about, to bust through silos, to use your words. Curious, Sophie, in terms of, documenting all of what we're seeing and impacts from the movements and women's rights organizations, is there this is a key moment just to document all of what's out there. Are there plans for something on the policy advocacy side to share with this community, or how are you envisioning sharing this back? Thanks, Gina, for your question.
Sure. So as you can imagine, because the information is coming in thick and fast, and because of the huge amounts of information about whether or not the cuts from USAID are going forward or not, the information is trickling in a variety of different ways. And Equality Fund is just one organization that is trying to gather that intel. So what we're doing is working across our peer funds as well to check in, to kind of gather as much information as we can. There are a number of different avenues through which that information is being collated at this point in time. But I'd say again that this is, a very fast-paced moving entity because of all the news that's coming in all at once. So I think it will be difficult to fully document the scale of what we're seeing quite right now, although we're getting a general picture of what the trends are. So we're working with our peer funds to collate this information on the size of the funding cuts that we're seeing that are coming up across a variety of government, across a variety of foreign aid budgets across governments. We're also trying to work on, really kind of spelling out what is required, what is needed at this point, so that we do have unified messaging. So that is something that we're collaborating on together in the lead up to CSW, next month, which was, there wasn't supposed to be agreed conclusions this year with CSW. We had Beijing plus 30 to celebrate, but the goalposts have drastically moved. So CSW will be a really key advocacy opportunity, I think, for all of us to make clear what is required, what's the huge amount of resources that we're seeing being cut, etc. And then I think it's a question of, at what point might it be helpful to collate all of these very specific examples of impacts, and if we want to put it into a report. But we do have all the raw data that's coming in, but it's a question of what we do with it, how we communicate that information. And Jess already shared a very specific example, as did I, from Albania. So I think that's what we're trying to do at this juncture, but that will certainly develop as time progresses as well.
Thanks, Sophie. And I think, you saw Diana's question here about, is there an opportunity to use the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women to be more coordinated, to have some of these conversations? I think you spoke a little bit on the policy side, what there are plans. And for those who don't know, the Commission on the Status of Women is the United Nations conference that's happening next month in New York City, that spans 2 weeks, and has a series of civil society activation points also for folks to come together and corral that are facing the real impacts of what we're talking about here today. But just wondering, anything to add there, Jess, on CSW in particular?
Well, the one comfort, we may be the underdog here. We may be the David, the Davida. I don't know who we are. But what I would say is that one thing we know how to do is organize, right? And so we're going to get organized. And Sophie's very right that the CSW is taking a whole new momentum, dimension, level of seriousness, level of the thing that happens in what we jokingly call sometimes in the Equality Fund a crisis tunity, is that we bust through the silos and we bust through the thinking, and this is actually when some of the best work happens, and when the ability to build trust and uncommon and unlikely partnerships is accelerated. And so that's my hope, actually, for CSW, is that that's what we're able to do, that the crisis brings us together and we're able to forge deep, new, bold partnerships in ways that maybe haven't been enabled in the past. And so I also just maybe briefly, Vidya, I saw a question on social enterprise, I think from Anita, and I wanted to speak to that because it is a really important part of our model. Part of this, like being a self-sustaining, independent, self-revenue generating organization with that is sort of liberated outside of the spaces of these spaces, has been to create an impact investing model that really sees the funding that we've received, for example, from the Government of Canada, move through a 100% gender lens impact investment portfolio. Part of that includes private equity and supporting women entrepreneurs and any number of things in that regard. And so that the Equality Fund resource pool, whether it's through grant making dollars or it's through investment capital, is working in service of the transformative change that we're trying to bring about for gender equality with the various different levels. Different forms of capital are being used in different ways vis-a-vis the Equality Fund to accelerate change, whether that's through women social entrepreneurs or whether that's through activists at the front line.
Thanks, Jess, making my job easier. Thanks for taking that one as well. I think that's a really good, 2 good examples, I think, of ways that we're thinking about multi-year partnership. We're thinking about different kinds of partnerships for this work, knowing that it'll take all of us to really build the world that we want to see. So appreciating, you very much. And then I think in terms of, just to close this out, this is a community that's also deeply invested in the philanthropy and ways to support the organizing and the movements, and philanthropic envelopes and capital also being such a small part of the story, but also a very critical part of the story. So curious about ways you think you would encourage this community to think about approaching this moment.
Can I go?
Yeah. No need to raise hands here. We're among friends.
My favorite question. I mean, here's the thing about the role of philanthropy. So my beloved ex co-CEO and friend forever and friend to the Equality Fund always like she embedded this inside of us, which is that philanthropy has such a powerful role to play. It moves quickly. It can de-risk initiatives. It can set tone and tenor. It can bring new folks to the table. It is absolutely a catalytic lever to build multidimensional, multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I have witnessed over my time at the Equality Fund just the degree of influence and leverage that philanthropy brings to this work through individuals, in fact. And what I have witnessed, and I think one of the things that has warmed me the most, is that the philanthropic individuals that are inside the Equality Fund who give themselves to this organization and to this work, of course, support the resource mobilization efforts. Vidya mentioned it. There's a $900 million ask out there, and we can't meet it. That's just big, and it's sort of beyond comprehension. But this, this work that philanthropy does is not just about the money. Where it has been most powerful for me and for the organization is the other forms of capital. I have seen, and some of you are on this call, I have seen you step in and step up with your social capital, your political capital, your financial capital, your spiritual capital, your friendship capital, whatever that is, because that's what it requires right now. It's like this all in, right? This is an incredibly important fork in the road, turning point moment in history. I really do believe that. And I'm honored to be in this group amongst the partners that we have, because it's so rarely just a check, Vidya. And I really believe that that's what philanthropy brings to the table.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, Jess, because, and we've really felt and have had the privilege of feeling the testament of true partnership here, in the sense of it is the philanthropic gift. It is the financial capital. I mean, we will generously receive that always, but it's how you show up and how you're willing to be a real player, at the table, and what are the ways that you're going to move and shake alongside movement leaders that we know, have the solutions, have the agency, but often just require more belief in at times, because the impact is so intangible at times, and it really is shifting norms and beliefs and hearts and community for the greater good. So really appreciating that. And then I think maybe to leave us with, it's the beginning of a new year, although it's felt like a very long year already, in the last couple of weeks. But curious about one hope you're carrying with you moving forward in 2025. Sophie, I'll come to you, and then Jess to close us out.
One hope. I think for me, it's to remain optimistic. I think these times have the ability to really trample on your belief in humanity, and just to completely and utterly overwhelm you. So I do want to stay positive, see where there are opportunities or green shoots, silver linings, whatever it is that you want to call them, in amidst this shadow that we're in at this present time. And I know this is a bit of a policy wonk answer as well, but for me, I think in amidst this crisis that we've seen over the last 2 months, and the USAID has just taken up all the oxygen in the room. But one thing that I found an interesting development last week was that the government of Australia had released its new international gender equality strategy. And under normal circumstances, that would have just been a blip on the radar. Oh yeah, okay, another government that has released an international development strategy on gender equality. But I think at this particular moment, to talk about gender equality at a time when LGBTI rights are being retreated, I think it is an important signal. There's questions to be had on how it will be resourced, how it will be actionable, the rest of it. But I think these are where can we take hope in how in some governments around the world are moving in a positive direction, despite all the vitriol and right-wing trajectory that we're seeing everybody else move in. So I thought that was a little glimmer of hope for me last week, which just using gender equality alone at this point is such a tremendous move in the right direction. But remain optimistic, remain sane, keep afloat. I think that's my 2025 mantra.
Jess, what's your one hope?
Two-parter. Vidya, can I have a two-parter? It'll be quick. I would say I wish for everyone on this call to be well, because and I wish for us all to manage our adrenals, because if we are not, then they also this other side wins, because they take away our joy. And so I know it's hard, but I wish for you all to also prioritize being well, because we are in a long game. And I think the second piece is this old adage, that crisis is the mother of invention. So I hope for us that this crisis is happening so that we can be inventive and creative and open in terms of how we build back better. I'm holding on to that.
Thanks, Jess. And lots of hopes being shared by our community too. So thank you all for joining today. It's our commitment to come back to this community quarterly in terms of community chats and give you an insider peek into what's happening in real time at the Equality Fund, and also an opportunity to ask questions to members of the team. So appreciating everybody making the time amidst very busy schedules, and we hope to see you soon. Take good care.